The air was still heavy with diesel fumes when she appeared. Neon green tracksuit, designer heels clicking across my driveway like a countdown to trouble. She didn't knock. She didn't say hello. She just slapped a bright orange fine on my windshield with the precision of someone who's done it 100 times before. $500. For what? Apparently, my U-Haul was disrupting the aesthetic harmony of Willowbrook Estates. My name's Marcus, and I hadn't even turned off my engine before the president of this HOA decided I was a criminal. Her name was Deirdre Pickering. Though the neighborhood whispered it like a curse, she didn't stop at the truck. From a folder thicker than a law textbook, she pulled out violation after violation. 14 in total, reciting them in a tone that sounded like she'd been waiting for this moment all week. Mailbox height, grass length, the color of my doormat. She even paused once, as if considering whether breathing too loudly violated the bylaws. Her perfume smelled expensive but sharp, the kind of scent that makes your nose itch and your guard go up. When she finally looked me in the eye, her smile was sweet enough to give you cavities. "You've got 48 hours to pay $2,100, she said, "or we'll have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings." I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because right then, I realized something. She had no idea who she was talking to. I've spent 20 years in commercial property management. I've handled buildings worth more than this entire subdivision. And as fate would have it, I own the house she lives in. But before I tell you how I ended up here, with this woman waving fake fines like they were death warrants, I need to take you back 3 months. Back to Phoenix, Arizona, where my life was falling apart faster than I could tape it together. The company I'd worked for 2 decades decided my department was redundant. 20 years of making their buildings profitable, and they sent me out the door with a cardboard box and a security escort. The same week, my ex-wife announced she was keeping the house and moving in with her yoga instructor, a guy named Moonbeam, who sold crystals at farmers markets. So when my great-aunt Millicent's lawyer called to say she'd left me her property in Colorado, I took it as a lifeline. Millicent wasn't just family. She was a force of nature. The kind of woman who could rebuild a transmission and still have pies cooling on the counter by sunset. She raised 3 kids on her own after my Uncle Frank died in Vietnam. Worked 2 jobs and somehow still fed every stray cat in a 5-block radius. The house was in Willowbrook Estates, a subdivision that started out middle class in the late 70s, but had gotten fancy over the years. People here drove imported cars, but they still argued over who was covering the tip at dinner. HOA dues were $180 a month, supposedly for landscaping, pool upkeep, and community standards enforcement, words that sounded innocent enough until you met the enforcer. I should have known trouble was coming. The lawyer mentioned Aunt Millicent had ongoing disputes with the HOA. I figured it was something small. Maybe she planted petunias without permission or kept a garden gnome that violated the sacred code of suburban aesthetics. I was wrong. On the day I arrived, the heat made the asphalt smell like a burning tire shop. That's when Deirdre stepped out of a pristine white BMW like some suburban villain from a soap opera. Her athleisure outfit probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and she wore a professional-grade camera around her neck like she was documenting war crimes instead of mailbox paint chips. She circled my truck with the precision of a predator, camera clicking faster than a Geiger counter. When she read my name off the violation sheet, in elegant calligraphy no less, I realized these weren't spur-of-the-moment complaints. This was premeditated bureaucratic warfare. Commercial vehicles are prohibited in residential zones, she announced, pointing at the faded decals on my F-150. Never mind that it was my personal truck. She gestured at Aunt Millicent's rose bushes, which had been blooming here since Carter was president, and said they were an unapproved landscaping modification. Then she dropped the pièce de résistance. Mailbox exhibits paint. Degradation exceeding community standards. Paint degradation. 3 chips in the paint, barely visible unless you were searching for flaws. But the worst part wasn't the absurdity of the violations. It was the way the neighbors reacted. Curtains twitched. An elderly woman across the street slammed her blinds shut. A man washing his car suddenly found the need to check his tire pressure. Everyone was pretending not to see what was happening, like they were afraid, and that's when she said it. The previous owner had compliance challenges before her unfortunate passing. The word unfortunate came out cold, calculated, like Aunt Millicent's death was just another item on her to-do list. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me. This woman had a history. She clicked away to her BMW, leaving me with $2,100 in bogus fines and a very clear message. I'd been marked. What she didn't realize? I don't scare easy, and I had 20 years' worth of experience in the one thing she clearly feared most, finding out where the money really goes. The certified letter showed up the next morning, wedged in my front door like a threat from a mob boss. Thick, official, sealed tight. Deirdre hadn't wasted a single night. The $2,100 in bogus fines had magically grown to $2,970 thanks to administrative processing fees and late penalties that somehow accumulated while I was asleep. She'd attached time-stamped photos of my truck from half a dozen angles, each one more dramatic than the last. You'd think she was building a case for a war crimes tribunal instead of an HOA meeting. At the bottom, in bold, was the threat. Failure to remit payment in full within 30 days will result in lien placement on your property. Most people would have been rattled. That's what she counted on. But in my world, 20 years of managing commercial properties taught me that power isn't about who yells loudest. It's about who knows where to look for the paper trail. So I drove straight to the county recorder's office. If you've never been there, imagine the DMV's ugly cousin. The same flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and lost hope. Clerks who look at you like you've personally caused their bad day. But public records are exactly that, public, and no amount of HOA bluster can hide them. That's where I found the first crack in Deirdre's kingdom. The original HOA covenants from 1983 were a slim, reasonable document, 12 pages of common-sense rules. Keep your lawn tidy. Don't turn your house into a carnival. No unregistered junkers in the driveway. That was it. Somewhere over the years, those 12 pages had mutated into a 47-page monster regulating everything from acceptable Christmas light colors to the appropriate duration of children's sidewalk chalk drawings. And here's the kicker. Most of those amendments required a majority homeowner vote. The voting records? Non-existent. Even better, Aunt Millicent's property had grandfathered landscaping rights. Those rose bushes Deirdre wanted gone? They were specifically protected under the original covenant. Her violation notice was as legally binding as a sticky note. But I wasn't done digging. As a property owner, I had every right to see the HOA's financial records. It took some arm twisting, but when I got my hands on them, I felt my pulse. Change, expenses that didn't add up. Landscaping contracts priced higher than commercial malls I'd managed. Pool maintenance fees that could have covered a 5-star resort for a pool the size of a large living room. That's when I met Gladys. 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and retired after 4 decades as a librarian. She'd been watching me from across the street, and that afternoon, she shuffled over with a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "You're asking about the HOA," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder like we were planning a prison break. "Good, someone needs to." Inside her folder was 2 years' worth of neighborhood intelligence. Violation notices, board meeting minutes, even photos. It read like a hit list. 12 families targeted in 2 years. The same pattern every time. Bogus fines, impossible. Deadlines, forced sales below market value. And the buyer? Always tied to the same real estate company, Deirdre's. 3 elderly residents had already been driven out. One for a mailbox post that leaned 2 degrees off vertical. Another for excessive children's toys, because her grandkids left a bike in the yard. A Korean War veteran had been cited because his American flag was improperly proportioned for his pole. It stopped being about me right then. This was bigger, much bigger. That afternoon, Deirdre returned, but she wasn't alone. Her boyfriend, Chad, trailed behind, wearing a badge so fake it probably came from a Halloween store clearance bin. They demanded entry to inspect for interior covenant violations. I reminded them of the Fourth Amendment. Chad started peering through my windows like a discount private investigator. That's when I decided to drop my first breadcrumb. Funny thing, I said, just loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The HOA budget lists $40,000 for landscaping, but the actual contractor's invoices? $15,000. Makes you wonder where that other 25 grand went. You could have heard a dust mite sneeze. Deirdre's face cycled through more shades than a neon sign on the fritz. Chad suddenly remembered he had somewhere to be. They left fast, but not before promising serious legal consequences for my so-called harassment. The next morning, a city code enforcement truck rolled up. The inspector, clearly uncomfortable, said he'd gotten a complaint about an abandoned commercial vehicle, my perfectly legal F-150. He walked around it, found nothing wrong, and apologized before leaving. But he leaned in before he left and said, "Funny. Caller knew your exact address, license plate, and decal description. Real specific for a random tip." 2 hours later, the state contractor licensing board called. Someone had reported that I was running an unlicensed business out of my home. Same story. Case closed in minutes, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about intimidation. This was psychological warfare. That night, at 2:17 a.m., my security cameras caught her BMW circling my block. Chad crept across my front yard, dropping a fresh pile of dog waste on my porch. The next morning, I found spray paint on my mailbox. Nothing obscene, just enough to generate another violation. She thought she was wearing me down, but every step she took just gave me more evidence. And the deeper I dug into those records, the more I realized this wasn't some petty power trip. This was organized theft, dressed up in HOA letterhead, and I'd only just started pulling the thread. The deeper I went into the HOA's books, the more it felt like peeling back the drywall in an old house and finding rot in every beam. The landscaping contract? Mountain View Landscaping. $3,000 a month for mowing postage stamp lawns and trimming a few hedges. I'd managed shopping centers for less than that. The pool maintenance? $800 a month for a 30-foot pool that looked like a science experiment gone wrong, green water thick enough to hide a body. Then I found the connection. Mountain View Landscaping was owned by Deirdre's nephew, 23, no landscaping. License, previous job experience, GameStop and a pizza delivery gig he didn't last in. Elite Pool Services? That was Chad's company, if you could call a few buckets of chlorine and YouTube tutorials a company. And the HOA's go-to law firm, Legal Solutions LLC? Run by Deirdre's old college roommate. Every single vendor in Willowbrook Estates was tied to her inner circle. Every inflated dollar flowed into the same web of family and friends. I'd seen scams like this in commercial real estate. Board members steering contracts to their own people, skimming off the top while pretending they were serving the community. But here it was dressed up in pastel houses and manicured lawns. That's when Bob knocked on my door. Vietnam vet, hands like he could bend steel barehanded, carrying 2 beers. He'd been watching, waiting to see if I was worth trusting. Over the next hour, he told me stories that made my stomach turn. Road repairs billed but never done, drainage projects that existed only on paper, a security system upgrade that turned out to be one broken camera pointed at a tree. Sophia showed up next. Single mom, paralegal by day, determined truth seeker by night. "You're not the only one she's hit," she said, sliding a stack of files across my table. "I can help you find the paper she's trying to hide." Even Pastor Williams from the local church stopped by, offering quiet support. "She tried to get us cited for excessive parking during Sunday service," he said. "People like that. They count on neighbors keeping their heads down." It didn't take long before my kitchen became a war room. Bob brought engineering reports. Sophia brought case law. Gladys, my 78-year-old neighborhood spy, brought more documentation than some police departments could manage. Every piece painted the same picture. Selective enforcement against those least able to fight back, while her allies got away with murder. We started meeting quietly at Rosie's Diner, the only place in town where Deirdre didn't have eyes or ears. One booth at first, then 2. By the 3rd week, 23 residents were showing up, bringing their own violation notices, their own stories of harassment. Mrs. Patterson, widowed, said she'd been fined for excessive memorial decorations when she placed a small flag at her late husband's grave marker in her yard. The Johnsons were cited because their kids' chalk drawings lasted beyond the acceptable temporary period. Hearing their voices crack as they told their stories lit a fire under me. It was no longer about me winning. It was about us not losing. Then came her next move. A police cruiser rolled up to my curb one morning, Officer Rodriguez stepping out, with a file under his arm. "She's filed a report," he said, looking exhausted. "Claims you threatened her finances and harassed her in public." I walked him through my security footage. Every second of my so-called threatening behavior was just me standing in my driveway while she barked orders. He closed the file but gave me a quiet warning. "Document everything. This kind of thing, it usually gets worse before it gets better." He was right. That afternoon, Deirdre herself showed up with a certified letter, $47,000 in special assessments for improvements that didn't exist. A new playground? No. Upgraded security? Just the broken tree camera. Road repairs? The same potholes stared back at me from the street. I read it twice, then laughed out loud. She'd just given me exactly what I needed, blatant overreach, in writing. That night, I pulled Aunt Millicent's old recipe box from the pantry. I'd been meaning to sort through it. Between the apple pie and pot roast cards was a small brass key. I knew instantly what it was for. The safety deposit box was in the next town over under Millicent's name. Inside, neat stacks of manila. Envelopes, labeled by year, photos, bank statements, audio recordings, even forged signature sheets from fake covenant amendments, and at the top, a letter in her handwriting. "Marcus, if you're reading this, Deirdre Pickering is still in power. I've done all I can, but I'm too old to finish this fight. Please, make them pay." I stared at those words for a long time. This wasn't just about bogus fines anymore. My aunt's blood pressure had spiked dangerously the year her war, with the HOA began. The doctor's records confirmed it. She'd died trying to protect her neighbors, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was taking her place in the fight. The court-ordered financial records arrived on a Thursday morning that smelled like rain and reckoning. My attorney, Jennifer Olivia, 15 years in HOA law, reputation for making corrupt board members cry in depositions, had worked some legal magic, and now every one of Deirdre's guarded secrets lay across my dining room table like evidence from a crime scene. It was worse than I'd imagined. Over $300,000 siphoned out of HOA accounts through an elaborate shell game, fake emergency assessments for repairs that were never done, invoices for materials that never arrived, payments to contractors who, on paper, looked legitimate, until you realized they were her relatives with business licenses barely a week old. But the thing that made my coffee taste like victory? Buried in the property title research was a clause about mineral rights. Turns out, Aunt Millicent's corner lot sat on a small natural gas deposit. Nothing huge, but enough for Rocky Mountain Energy to have been paying royalties for 3 years. $18,000. Money that should have gone to the property owner. Instead, it had been quietly funneled into the HOA's general fund, with Deirdre as the sole signatory. That gave me standing to demand a full forensic audit going back to the year she took power. And with Aunt Millicent's safety deposit, box evidence, audio recordings, forged homeowner signature sheets, bank statements, the audit was going to be a massacre. This wasn't going to be a one-man war. I started assembling a team. Sophia, our paralegal-turned-legal research goddess, spent her nights in the law library, coming back with case precedents and procedural traps that most lawyers wouldn't think to use. Her dining table turned into a color-coded battlefield. Red for criminal violations, blue for civil damages, yellow for procedural breaches. Bob took point on infrastructure fraud. With 40 years of engineering under his belt, he documented every repair the HOA had, billed for but never completed. His report read like an indictment: road work that didn't exist, drainage improvements that existed only on invoices, and a security system made of exactly one broken camera pointing at a maple tree. Gladys, our 78-year-old intelligence officer, brought the kind of organizational discipline only a lifetime librarian could muster. She cataloged every document, every violation notice, and every whispered rumor that could be corroborated. She also baked cookies for our war room, because apparently even revolutions run better on sugar. Our meetings moved from kitchen tables to the church basement, where Pastor Williams lent moral authority and a discreet, safe space. Word spread, quietly, and the attendance doubled every week. The WhatsApp group Sophia started exploded from 5 people to 37, residents sharing photos of violations, documenting harassment, and encouraging each other in ways they hadn't dared before. It was turning into a grassroots movement. The forensic accountant Jennifer brought in was a quiet man with a mind like a scalpel. He traced the money through more shell companies than a Russian oligarch. His presentation looked like the blueprint of a criminal empire: fake invoices feeding inflated payments, routed through family-owned businesses, then landing in accounts. Tied to Deirdre and her circle. We didn't just prepare for court. We prepared for battle in every arena. A media consultant who'd worked in investigative journalism helped us craft a narrative the public could understand. Elderly residents targeted, families harassed, hundreds of thousands stolen. Sarah Mitchell, a corruption reporter from the local paper, jumped on the story. The Denver TV affiliate followed. Suddenly, this wasn't just neighborhood gossip. It was news. The evidence package swelled to over 800 pages. Financial records, before and after photos of promised improvements. That never happened. Audio recordings of Deirdre calling residents sheep and boasting about creative accounting. I practiced my delivery with the local community theater group. Nothing prepares you for a hostile audience like amateur actors heckling your pauses. We rehearsed until I could recite every fact without glancing at my notes. We printed handbooks for residents. HOA rights and remedies, outlining how to demand transparency, challenge selective enforcement, and recognize board-level fraud. It was practical, but it was also a message. We weren't afraid anymore. When we reserved the community center for the mandatory annual meeting, we made sure it was done by the book. Professional recording equipment, legal observers from the Attorney General's office, media invited. Once the notice went out, she couldn't cancel it without breaking state law. The night before the meeting, I sat at Aunt Millicent's kitchen table, now covered in bankers' boxes and evidence binders, feeling that same steady calm I'd known in the military before a mission. I could almost hear her voice. "Don't just win, Marcus. Make it so they can't come back." Across the street, I saw the curtains twitch in Deirdre's living room. I knew she was plotting her own counterattack. But this time, she wasn't the only one with a plan. The gossip network in Willowbrook Estates was faster than any intelligence agency I'd ever seen. Word got back to Deirdre that the residents were organizing, and her reaction was like watching a cornered animal lash out. First, she tried to cancel the annual meeting, claiming security concerns and warning about outside agitators who might bring violence to the community. The irony was almost funny. The same woman who had terrorized her neighbors for years was suddenly clutching her pearls about safety. But Colorado state law is clear. Once proper notice of a mandatory HOA meeting goes out, you can't just decide democracy is inconvenient and cancel it. So she pivoted. She hired a private security company to protect the event, hoping to intimidate residents before they even got through the door. That blew up in her face when the security manager asked her to explain the threat, realized it was just an internal HOA dispute, and refused to get involved. Next came the smear campaign. She started telling anyone who would listen that I was an outside agitator sent to destroy the community. She told Mrs. Rodriguez I was planning to turn Willowbrook into a gang stronghold. Apparently, she thought the gang in question was made up of retired librarians, church volunteers, and military veterans, the people she'd been pushing around for years. Her desperation bled into finances. The bank had already frozen $89,000 in HOA funds pending investigation, so she tried to withdraw it in cash before the freeze took effect. When that failed, she attempted to destroy HOA financial records, which only added obstruction of justice to her growing list of federal problems. The intimidation escalated too. Fake reviews about me appeared online, claiming I was violent, unstable, and threatening to peaceful residents. She filed false DMV reports about my truck being illegally modified in ways that didn't exist. Chad started following me to job interviews, lurking in parking lots like a badly written crime drama villain. The creepiest moment came in the grocery store. I noticed her down every aisle I turned into, positioning herself just far enough away to pretend it was coincidence. When I finally asked if she needed something, she said she was monitoring potential threats to community safety. The store manager threw her out. Meanwhile, the people standing with me began to get hit too. Gladys received a violation notice for excessive bird feeding. Apparently, her sunflower seeds were attracting undesirable wildlife. Sophia was cited for her children's bikes being improperly stored inside her own garage. Bob's military flag was written up for unauthorized colors on a non-federal holiday. Anonymous phone calls started late at night, whispering threats to mind your own business. Dead flowers appeared on Sophia's doorstep with a note. This could be you. When we filed a police report, Officer Rodriguez added it to what he called the Pickering file. Turns out, we weren't her first victims, just the first ones willing to fight back. Then came the crack in her armor. Her longtime lawyer, the college roommate who'd been enabling her for years, suddenly withdrew from the case. She'd realized the liability was too great for a civil attorney to handle. The new lawyer's first move was to try and negotiate a deal, partial restitution in exchange for reduced charges. I said no. This wasn't about settling. This was about ending her reign for good, and that's when she tried the dumbest move yet. Late one night, headlights lit up my driveway. She stepped out of her BMW carrying a duffel bag. $50,000 in cash. Let's put this unpleasantness behind us, she said, smiling like she was doing me a favor. What she didn't know was that I was wired for the FBI. Agent Martinez had suggested it after her failed escape attempt to Montana, and my property management background made me a perfect candidate for undercover work. For 47 minutes, I kept her talking. She admitted to borrowing HOA funds, inventing fake assessments, and being creative with accounting to support her lifestyle. My favorite line? You understand how these communities work, right? The residents are sheep who need someone to make decisions for them. The agent listening in my ear might have broken a pencil from gripping it too hard. The bribery alone was a new felony, but the recorded confession? That was the bulletproof vest our case needed. By now, 41 of 47 households openly supported our coalition. The 6 holdouts were relatives or people financially tied to her. The rest of us were done being afraid. The community fund we'd started to help elderly residents with legal costs had grown to over $12,000. Local businesses were stepping in. The restaurant down the road offered to cater the meeting. The hardware store donated supplies to fix vandalism damage. Even the mailman started reporting suspicious activity to us. National HOA abuse groups began calling, offering advice and sharing stories from across the country. Our little war in Willowbrook was becoming a rallying cry. Her professional life collapsed in weeks. The real estate brokerage fired her after the bribery news hit. The licensing board suspended her. Former clients came forward with complaints going back years. She filed for personal bankruptcy thinking it would hide her assets, but that only made the federal prosecutors hungrier. Her own house went into foreclosure. The woman who had threatened to take homes from others was now losing hers, but she wasn't finished. For the meeting, she planned to bring Chad and 3 relatives to stack the room, blame everything on the management company, and paint me as the villain. It was a bold plan, but she had no idea just how ready we were to take her apart, piece by piece in front of everyone. The morning of the annual meeting, Willowbrook's community center buzzed like it was hosting a prize fight. By 7 a.m., residents were already showing up with folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and the kind of anticipation you feel before a storm breaks, the smell of floor wax mixed with caffeine and adrenaline. 73 residents crammed into a space designed for 50. Local media set up tripods in the back, microphones clipped to their collars. Sarah Mitchell from the paper was their notebook ready. The Denver TV affiliate had sent their investigative reporter. Apparently, HOA corruption was now prime-time material. At 9:20 she arrived. Deirdre, flanked by Chad and 3 reluctant-looking relatives, made her tactical entrance. Navy blazer, hair perfect, briefcase in hand, like she was walking into a corporate boardroom instead of a room full of people she'd been bleeding dry for years. She made a beeline for the front, took the head seat, and immediately tried to seize control. "First order of business," she said into the microphone she'd brought herself, "removing Marcus from this community for disruptive behavior and threats to public safety." The room erupted, not with agreement, but outrage. That's when Gladys stood, 78 years old, voice clear as a church bell. "Point of order," she said, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "Under Colorado law, and per our own rules, homeowner input is required before any business can be conducted. You cannot remove a resident without due process." Applause broke out. People who had hidden behind curtains months ago were now standing tall. Deirdre's face cycled through red, white, and a shade of purple I'd only ever seen on bad seafood. I walked to the front, slow and steady, the USB drive in my pocket feeling like a loaded weapon. "I'd like to share some information," I said, my voice steady enough to cut through the noise. I started with Aunt Millicent, how she'd spent her last years collecting evidence to protect this community. I showed the photos of her rose bushes, still thriving, that Deirdre had tried to rip out. I let the room see her last letter to me, written in her careful script, asking me to finish the fight she couldn't. Then I dropped the visuals. The forensic accountant's charts lit up the screen. $447,000 siphoned away through inflated contracts, fake repairs, and non-existent improvements. Before and after photos of renovations that existed only in invoices. Audio clips of Deirdre calling residents sheep and bragging about being creative with accounting. The gasps were real. Elderly residents wept quietly. Bob's voice cracked when he stood and confirmed his engineering report. Thousands spent on repairs that never happened. And then, the recording. The one from the night she brought me the duffel bag of cash. Her voice, clear as day, admitting to theft, falsifying assessments, and treating the community like her personal ATM. You understand how these communities work, right? The residents are sheep. Silence for 3 seconds. Then the room exploded. Shouts. Applause. A couple of people stood just to glare at her. She tried to interrupt, screaming about lies, forgeries, and conspiracies, and then she made her fatal mistake. She went for the smear she'd been using behind closed doors. "These people don't understand our traditional community values," she said, her eyes cutting to me in a way that left no one guessing what she meant. It was like someone flipped a switch. People who had lived together for decades, watched each other's kids grow up, survived deployments, funerals, divorces, turned on her instantly. I let the moment hang before speaking again. "My great-aunt believed communities are built on trust, not fear," I said. "Today, we take that trust back." From the back of the room, Detective Williams from Financial Crimes stepped forward. "Just so everyone's aware," he said, "formal charges are being filed. The FBI is reviewing evidence for federal prosecution. The State Attorney General's office is pursuing civil penalties, and effective today, Ms. Pickering's real estate license is permanently revoked. The vote to remove the entire board wasn't even close. Unanimous. New leadership was appointed on the spot. I was named Financial Oversight Chair. The community approved criminal prosecution by acclamation. TV cameras caught her final meltdown, screaming about conspiracies, lawsuits, and how we'd all regret this, while Chad physically held her back from lunging at anyone. 5 minutes later, it was over. We'd reclaimed the community. The standing ovation lasted longer than the vote. I looked around at faces that, just months ago, had been shadowed with fear. Now, they looked lighter, freed. And for the first time since I'd arrived in Willowbrook Estates, I believed my great-aunt could finally rest. 6 months later, the headlines told the rest of the story. Former HOA president sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for embezzlement and mail fraud. Deirdre's guilty plea came after her new attorney, a real one this time, explained that fighting the evidence would be like arguing with gravity. Chad got 18 months as an accomplice. Her nephew's landscaping company folded when the IRS started digging into creative tax strategies that made her HOA accounting look like amateur hour. The asset seizure recovered $312,000 through bank accounts, real estate holdings, and the sale of her beloved BMW, the unofficial symbol of suburban tyranny. For the first time in years, Willowbrook's money went where it was supposed to. The pool, neglected so long it had looked like a swamp from a bad horror movie, was drained, scrubbed, and refilled. Crystal clear, with kids splashing in it instead of mosquitoes. HOA dues dropped from $180 a month to $95, proving that honest. Management cost far less than funding a personal crime spree, the playground she'd billed for but never built. We built it. For real this time. Watching kids climb and swing on equipment paid for with money she'd tried to steal was the sweetest revenge I've ever tasted. The same children she'd targeted for chalk violations were now laughing. Under a bright blue sky. Marcus Cleaning and Property Solutions, my new consulting business, took off faster than I expected. Word spread that I knew how to spot HOA fraud and dismantle it legally. Communities across Colorado called desperate for help. 23 clients in the first year, recovering more than $2 million in stolen funds, and it didn't stop there. Colorado passed new legislation, not officially named after me, but everyone called it Marcus's Law, requiring public financial audits for HOAs with more than 25 homes. It included whistleblower protections and criminal penalties for board members caught misappropriating funds. Other states started drafting their own versions. Willowbrook itself transformed. Millicent's garden became the centerpiece of a memorial space next to the community center. We planted her favorite roses and set up a little tool library where neighbors could borrow gardening equipment or share seeds. Gladys appointed herself unofficial community historian, documenting the shift from fear to actual democracy. Sophia finished her paralegal certification and launched a nonprofit for HOA abuse victims. Bob took charge of infrastructure, making sure every dollar spent on repairs showed up in the streets, not in someone's pocket. The first Millicent Day drew over 200 people. Residents, former neighbors, even families from other communities inspired by our story. The local news covered it as a model for what happens when ordinary people stop being afraid. A documentary crew showed up a few months later, saying law schools were studying our case as a template for HOA reform. Walking the neighborhood now was a completely different experience. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about fines. Elderly residents tended their gardens without measuring their grass down to the millimeter. Neighbors stopped to talk instead of hiding behind blinds. Even the numbers reflected the change. Property values jumped 12% in less than a year. Turns out trust and honest leadership are better for home prices than terror and arbitrary rules. Who knew? Sometimes when the sun sets just right, I see Aunt Millicent's roses glowing in the evening light. And I think about the woman who started this fight long before I knew it was mine. She didn't just leave me a house. She left me a mission. Victories weren't just legal or financial. They were human. People who'd been bullied into silence rediscovered their voices. Strangers became allies. Neighbors became friends. The sound of laughter replaced the sound of whispered complaints. And me? I finally understood what she meant in that letter. This wasn't about winning for the sake of winning. It was about making sure no one could ever pull this kind of stunt here again.
The second annual Millicent Day fell on one of those perfect late summer afternoons. The air warm but soft, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The memorial garden was in full bloom, her roses swaying gently in the breeze, their scent carrying across the community center lawn. Kids chased each other between the swings and the picnic tables. Neighbors lingered in small clusters, laughing, trading recipes, sharing tools. It felt like a different world from the one I'd arrived in a year ago, a world built on trust instead of intimidation. Aunt Millicent would have loved it. She'd have been there in her wide-brimmed sun hat, dirt under her fingernails from fussing with the flower beds, making sure everyone had a plate of food before sitting down herself. She'd have been proud not just of me, but of all of us. The documentary crew followed me around that day, asking about the turning point. But there wasn't just one. It was dozens of moments. Gladys sliding that manila folder across my kitchen table. Bob showing me the potholes that had been fixed on paper. Sophia staying up late to dig through case law. Officer Rodriguez telling me to document everything. The first time a neighbor looked me in the eye and said, "I'm not scared anymore," told the crew the truth. This wasn't about a single hero riding in to save the day. This was about an entire neighborhood deciding enough was enough. All I did was light the match. The fire was already there. I still get calls from other communities every week. Sometimes it's a widow in tears because she's facing foreclosure over a made-up violation. Sometimes it's a young couple being fined for a garden they planted together. I tell them the same thing. You have more power than you think, but you have to be willing to use it. Willowbrook's story is proof. The national HOA reform movement is gaining momentum now. Law schools cite our case when they teach about fiduciary duty. State legislators have my number saved. Even the FBI keeps in touch, apparently. They've got a whole folder of Pickering-style scams they're working through. It's not all big victories, though. Some days it's just helping a neighbor fix a mailbox without worrying about whether the shade of paint will get them written up, or seeing a group of kids chalk the sidewalk without checking over their shoulders, or watching Sophia's nonprofit win its first case for a community 2 towns over. Those moments matter just as much as the headlines. On Millicent Day, I stood in the middle of the garden with the plaque we'd had made for her, in memory of Carter, who believed that communities are worth fighting for. I ran my fingers over the engraving and thought about the last line of her letter to me. Make them pay for what they've done to our neighbors. We did, but we also built something better in the process, something that will outlast the fines, the lawsuits, even the headlines. As the sun set and the crowd began to thin, I took one last walk through the garden. The light caught on the petals of her roses, making them glow like embers. Somewhere, in the distance, I heard laughter, the kind of free, unguarded sound that tells you people feel safe. That was the real victory. So if you're watching this, and you've got your own HOA nightmare, the fines, the intimidation, the endless, petty rules, hear me. You're not alone. The bylaws, the covenants, the threats, they're not as unshakable as they look. With the right people, the right evidence, and the courage to stand together, you can take your community back. Sometimes David beats Goliath, not because he's stronger, but because he refuses to back down. I learned that from my great aunt, and now, I'm passing it on to you. This is Marcus signing off from Willowbrook Estates, where we learned the hard way that trust is stronger than fear, and where we'll never forget the day we took our neighborhood back. Next week's story. Let's just say it involves a Karen, a parking spot, and the surprise that comes when you find out the person you're messing with owns the entire block. Thanks for tuning in to HOA Stories, where neighbors stand together, and karma always comes knocking, *.